Whom the Gods Fear, by Wdowski. Chapter 27. Before answering Anne's question, he stood up, went to the coffee machine, and poured himself a cup of coffee. The whole room turned their head, focusing on Glen, waiting for his answer. They watched him as he added some cream to his coffee and stirred it in. He took a sip and looked at the group sitting around the conference table, all patiently waiting for his answer. The cargo aboard the Venture was mostly Xingni's wheat seed. Glen replied. They had developed a type of wheat that can flourish in extremely arid environments. I had bought the wheat seed to sell to our colonies on Mars. They would have been a stable crop for the Martian soil. The plant is also accustomed to Xing 4's higher elevations, can thrive in minimum atmosphere, and is very efficient in turning CO2 into oxygen. He drank more of his coffee as he stood before the group. Those crops encircling those cities are my wheat. That means Demi and his men must be alive on the surface. There is no way they could have emptied the Venture of entire cargo with only one trip with only 4 freight shuttles. They had to have made at least a half-dozen runs each. You said most of the cargo was the Xingni's wheat. What was the rest of the cargo? Granite asked. 20 pounds in gold bars and 10 pounds platinum. In addition, rare earth elements, 1 ton of dysprosium, 2 tons terbium, 1 ton beryllium, half a ton of cobalt, 5 tons manganese. 1,000 cc of a Xingni's developed supervirus that boosts the body's immune system and even surgically attacks cancer cells. We also obtained a cache of Xingni's small arms, antimatter rifles to be exact. How large a cache? Granite pressed. 4, with at least 100,000 potential rounds each. 100,000 each? Asked Captain Mahan. Yes, the weapons each contain a magazine of microscopic magnetic vacuum-sealed pellets. Suspended in their centers is 16 nanograms of antimatter. When fired, the pellets break on impact against its target. The antimatter is released and reacts with the matter it contacts. My understanding is that it will vaporize through any matter with an impressive burst of energy. One shot could put a hole in a person or any known material the size of a grapefruit. Including ship's armor? Commander Granite worriedly asked, thinking of his father the Admiral and the First Fleet. Understanding Granite's concern, Glen responded, yes, most likely, but your father is aware of the weapon. I was obtaining them for the Department of Defense. So this is how you knew of the antimatter reactors the Xingni's have. Granite stated. That part of the cargo was top secret. We did not obtain the weapons through regular Xingni's government-approved channels, explained Glen. You stole them. Anne answered. No, we paid for them. It was just that those we bought them from did not exactly have the authority to sell them. Glen responded to Anne. He then turned to Granite. If it makes you feel more at ease, Commander, the Xingni's had not yet weaponized their ships with the antimatter weapons. Is still at the development stage. My understanding is we got a hold of their only prototypes. If Demi and his crew are armed with these weapons, in a society that hasn't any sign of weaponry, I think we can safely assume they are still alive. Mahan stated. I don't think it very likely they have fallen victim on this world. It sounds more likely this world could have fallen victim to them. With such arms, they would be in a much better position than Cortez was against the Aztecs. Dr. Verne pointed out. He shook his head, feeling sympathy for the porcelain elves. I see what you both mean. Glen agreed. No matter what, we need to find them. My best guess is we look for them in that complex that might be housing the runabouts. My question is, how do we do so? Do we send down a search and rescue team, a diplomatic mission, a covert insertion team, a research team, or an assault team? Ideally, I would love to send down a research team first, answered Hogan. It could never hurt to learn more about the porcelain elves before following up with a first-contact diplomatic mission. Even though Demi and his crew may be armed with these antimatter weapons, that doesn't guarantee they aren't being held against their will. Just because we haven't found any signs of weapons doesn't mean they don't exist. If I remember my history correctly, Dr. Verne, the Aztecs used club weapons and macuahoodles, wooden clubs embedded with obsidian blades. They wouldn't kill their enemies in combat outright. Instead, they wounded them to capture and enslave them, only to later ritually sacrifice them to their sun god, cutting out their beating hearts atop their temples. Glen went back to his seat. The imagery he described unsettled everyone around the conference table. If that is the case, I think we should send down a covert insertion team, followed by a rescue extraction team, recommended Commander Granite. I do not see any reason to think the worse of these people. Granted, it has only been a few days of observation, but we have not detected any violence in their culture. Dr. Hogan said as she looked at Granite. They don't even get in heated arguments in their markets. No public displays of couple spats. Better than us humans. Injected Dr. Morningsun. They have incisors, pointed out Glen. And they have the forward-looking eyes of predators. At some point in their evolutionary history, they were clearly hunters. From their markets, we know they are still at least herdsmen that feed on other animals. Crops and animal husbandry, more often than not, leads to territorial claims, which in turn leads to have and have-nots and conflicts. I think in a world with limited access to water, their history of violence may be as bloody as our own. Mahan's linguistic specialist cleared his throat to get Glen's attention. Yes, Specialist Stovall. I believe before you send any teams to the surface, we should take more time to master their language. It does not seem nearly as difficult as Xingnese. I am confident the computers can give us a working translation within a fortnight with more data from the observations of our spy fly drones. I think that would be wise. And Hogan agreed, turning to Glen after listening to the handsome young Marine. Glen responded gently, placing a fist on the conference table. I worry we may not have enough time to find Demi and return him to the fleet to stop this coming war. Mr. Yeager, if I may speak freely, responded Specialist Stovall. Glen turned to the young linguistic officer. Of course. I think if we have a functional mastery of their language, it will greatly speed up our chances of finding the whereabouts of Captain Demi. You can't argue with that. And pointed out to Glen. No, I can't. Glen concurred and turned his attention to all those around the conference table. 1 week. Put all our resources on translating this language. I want us to be able to send a landing party to the surface in no more than 1 week's time, not 2, as you requested, Specialist. We will have to get by with a working understanding of their language. In the future, we will hopefully have the time to have a full, complete, in-depth study of it. The officers all stood up, I, Mr. Yeager, and left the conference room to get to their task. And stayed behind, as the other science personnel also left. Yes, Anne? Glen asked her once they were alone. Ambassador Stern. What of her? You have her under lock and key in her cabin. She has not committed any crime. Glen leaned back slightly, just waiting for her to calm down. My understanding is she's already broken everything she can in there. He paused, then added dryly, oh wait, vandalism. Yes, vandalism is a crime. Interfering with the operations of an interstellar flight? Also a crime. Inciting a mutiny in the First Fleet? I'm pretty sure that's punishable too. He took a sip of coffee before finishing. They may not hang people for it anymore, like they did on the old wooden sailing ships. But I'd say her actions more than justify the Admiral removing her from the fleet and my placing her under cabin arrest. And seemed disappointed in Glen's reply. I understand your dislike of Rebecca Stern, but are you sure that you are not letting your own personal feelings fog your judgment in her case? I am quite sure my personal feelings are a factor. Glen seemed annoyed in Anne's defense of Rebecca. This is my ship. I never wanted her on board, in the first place. I made a special request to the State Department to please choose another diplomatic representative. Yet they ignored me and bullied me to take her on board. I finally get her off my ship, and the Admiral just dumps her right back in my lap. So locking her up is more than just Rebecca Stern. It is also your defiance of government authority, asked Anne. Don't you think that is a lot of burden to put on just one woman? Glen brewed as he calmed himself down and listened to what Anne was saying. Perhaps. He had to agree. He promised her, I will try to talk to her.